everybody's here, and it feels good to be in community. So thank you for your personal wishes. Rhoda, would you start us off, and then we'll introduce Rabbi Feinstein.
Hi, Taylor. First of all, welcome, Rabbi Feinstein. We're just so glad to have you back to teach and to inspire us again. And to to all of you, our benefactors, to our board members, it's always a privilege for me to have the opportunity to say thank you for your continued support of our synagogue. Brit Shalom remains vibrant, even though we are all at home, because of the efforts of our clergy, our staff, and our many volunteers. And your commitment of time and of financial resources has made all of this possible for us. So Todah Rabbi, and now I'm going to turn it back to Rabbi Teller.
Thank you, Rhoda, and thank you to all the benefactors and board members who are here. We rely on you to keep this shul going, and you step up every time. And so thank you so much. What an honor and a privilege to learn from Rabbi Feinstein again. He came to us a little while ago to teach us about what the Torah has to say about life, and what an amazing opportunity it is to hear from the rabbinic voice of a generation to help us through these times, by reminding us about the treasure of our tradition and how it can help us get through this pandemic and really enrich our lives in all ways. And there is no rabbi better suited to deliver this Torah in this time. And so I look forward once again to learning with Rabbi Feinstein. Todah Rabbi.
Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful once again to be in Houston, especially because I don't have to leave my living room. This is a machaya. And for those of you who are worried about the championship game in the NFC, you have nothing to worry about. The Texans and the Rams are not playing, so we might as well enjoy this, okay? So thank you for coming on. And I think, Barbara, if you're the host, if you could make me a co-host, that's good. Okay, thank you. I got it. And this way I can share the text with everyone. I hope everyone is well. A couple of
I didn't do a proper introduction. Would you just tell us a little bit about what you do? And
me?
Or yeah. There are a few
I grew up in a log cabin in Illinois. You know, a small black child. No, I work as just like Rabbi Teller. I work in an enormous conservative synagogue, which means I spend day and night trying to figure out how to take care of people. These days have been very challenging, without any humor, actually, because here in LA, I don't know what it's like by you. Here in LA, we are in the middle of a terrible upswing in the pandemic. We in our congregation, we have so many people who are sick and so many people who have died in the last 4 or 5 weeks. We've been going to the cemetery 3, 4, 5 times a week to do funeral services. And funeral services these days, of course, are very different than they ought to be, because we can't gather. And the inability to be together, to give a hug, to bring a coffee cake and a casserole, to share face to face, person to person, to hold a hand is so very difficult. And that so many of our loved ones are suffering alone, with no one in the hospital to visit them, no one in care facilities to be with them. It's been a really, really hard time. It's been a really, really hard time. And on the other side of that, of course, is that it's one of those very strange times, because it's been such a hard time. People are beginning to understand what community is for. You know, there's always somebody in the world who'll tell you they don't need to belong to a shul until a moment like this, when you really need a shul, when you need a community, when you need friends, when you need a rabbi, and you need a community that's organized to offer help. And in my synagogue, we have it's a large place, and somebody did a demographic study of the place and discovered that we have 180 elderly people living alone. So they set up a phone committee, and they're calling every one of those people every week, calling and seeing how you are and talking and just making sure that people are okay. And for people who need help, I have a crew of teenagers who are delivering food, groceries, and medicines, and going to fix computers. I made a deal with all of their parents, give the kid the car keys. I promise you he's doing a mitzvah. So they're out there doing mitzvahs with me. And it's, I'll tell you a funny story. It's like a story make you cry. Before the high holidays, I get a call from one of my kids. And he says, Rabbi, I'm standing in the CVS drugstore at such and such a corner. And I have Mrs. So-and-so's prescription, but the pharmacist won't give it to me. So I say, give him the phone. Let me say hello. So the guy introduces himself. He's Dr. So-and-so, is a pharmacist at CVS. And he says, Rabbi, I'm not allowed to give a kid drugs because, there's all these problems with drugs. And I said, well, are we talking about opioids here? And he laughed. He said, no, hemorrhoids. I say, listen, I promise you this kid is doing an errand for me. The lady in question is a woman way up in her years, and she can't get out of her apartment. And the kids volunteered to drop off the groceries and the prescription. I promise you, I'll get you the paperwork next time. Could you just help us out? And the guy said, sure, I think I can work that out. And then he says to me, he says, what synagogue are you? And I said, we're Valley Beth Shalom in Sino. He said, and you have kids delivering groceries and pharmaceutical? I said, I got kids, I got couples, I got families. We're just taking care of folks. And he said, can I join? Would you take a Catholic boy from Brooklyn? I said, we'd be delighted. Come on in. I mean, this is what we do for each other. So, these kinds of crises bring out the worst and they bring out the best. And I'm sure that you're all having the same experience. I'm sure poor Rabbi Teller has been killing himself trying to take care and trying to offer inspiration and trying to reach across these screens in order to help each other. So thank you to everyone who's helped. Today we're going to do some learning together, okay? Now, last time we met, which was in December, I taught some texts having to do with chutzpah, with the empowerment of human beings in the world. And I made the case that the principal theme of Judaism, at least as I read it, throughout the generations, is a theme that both empowers and charges us with a deep responsibility to bring blessing into the world. And that really is the leitmotif that runs through Torah, that runs through the medievals, that runs through modern Judaism. That's what we're here to do. And we took a moment to look at a text that seemed to be counter to that idea, which is the text of the Akedah. And I made an offhanded comment that this text is so important that it really deserves a session on its own. So being a very good listener, your friend Barbara here called me up right away and said, okay, big shot, you want to come on and do a session? We'll take you up on that. And so we're here. So we're going to be looking at a text together, just one text today, and all the interpretations. But it's one of the pivotal texts in the formation of Jewish ideas. And what you're going to see about this text is it's a text that is so opaque, that is so sort of minimalist. It's almost like one of these Japanese paintings. You ever go to the museum, or maybe you collect these and see this Japanese style of painting, and you realize that what you're looking at is only a few brushstrokes. That really what the painter has done so magically is enable us to use our imaginations to fill in all of the gaps. Well, the Akedah story, the story of the binding and the near sacrifice of Isaac, is exactly that. It is an opaque story which demands of us a great deal of us. It's almost more of us than what's on the page of the text. And that's what makes it such a powerful and important story. So there's really two levels that we can read it, with many levels we can read it on, but I want to do two levels today. One level we'll call Midrash, which is I want to do a close reading of the text itself. And the second level, I want to ask you, what does this text come to teach us? And specifically, I tend to be a big pragmatist when I read biblical texts. I want to know, what kind of religious universe does this text put us into? And what kind of religious people does this text make of us? Those are the questions I'd like to ask with you today. Okay. Now, today we have a relatively nice group. We have a small group here, not nice size group. So I'm going to teach. And here's what I'd like you to do. There's a little feature on your Zoom thing called chat. Everybody see where that is? On my screen, it's at the bottom of the page, but it might be at the top if you're on an iPad. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either write the question into the chat or just put your name in the chat. And I'll stop and we'll take some questions. Otherwise, you're going to discover that I have the pedagogic style of Benito Mussolini. So I need you to like throw a shoe at me if you want me to stop so we can actually talk about this stuff. And I would actually appreciate that. Okay? Everybody okay so far? Good. So let's jump right in together. When we read the stories of Abraham, our ancestor, we're reading a story about ourselves because he is, of course, the first. He is the founder. And the story of the founder is really a story of the self. So there's a reflexive aspect to Abraham's story. And if you read the narratives of Abraham, starting in the 12th chapter of Genesis and going to the 22nd chapter of Genesis, what you discover is there are two lines of narrative. And they play off of each other contrapuntally. There's a line of narrative that deals with Abraham and the covenant. And these are the stories of Abraham being charged by God to be God's partner in the world. Abraham's accepting of the covenant, the visions he has of covenant, Abraham as the covenantal leader. And the other line is Abraham as the head of a family. And the two go back and forth. There are these family narratives and these covenantal narratives. And they play off of each other until we get to this story. This is the last story of Abraham. The next story of Abraham has to deal with the death and the burial of Sarah and the marriage of Isaac, but that's no longer really about Abraham. He's sort of a co-star. This is the last big one where he's a star. And here, the family narrative and the covenant narrative come together. They come together in some senses tragically, and that's what the story is about. So let's look together. Now, here's how you play the Midrash game. Are you ready? The Midrash game is played very simply. We're going to read a line of text, and I want you to say out loud all the questions one could possibly ask about this text, even if it seems like an obvious question, even if it seems like a dumb question. There's no dumb questions in Midrash. So let's start at the beginning. Genesis 22. Sometime afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. Okay, what questions can we ask? First of all, sometime afterwards. What a weird way to start a story, right? I always want to start a sermon by going, and furthermore, and see if anybody notices, right? Did I fall asleep? I mean, what do you mean sometime after what? How can it be sometime after? It should be once upon a time but sometime afterwards? A weird way. It sort of drops us into time. It's a feature of dreams. You ever notice that in a dream, you don't know how you got into that dream. You don't know how you got to that place. I mean, all of a sudden you're on a beach in Hawaii and you don't know how you got there. It's just sometime afterwards, bam, here we are. God put Abraham to the test. What kind of test? Why does he need to test him? They've been together for a long time already. Is this a test you can study for? Is this the test you can pass? Why is he testing Abraham? What kind of test is it? Does Abraham know? If you know you're being tested, is it still a test? He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. That's a very formal way of address if you've been with somebody for a long time. And he said, and here's the commandment, ready? Take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights I will point out to you. Well, look at that line. First of all, you got to know a principle of Bible reading. Every word in the Bible is worth $1 million because some poor schnook had to carry this on his back for 3,000 years. So every word counts. Now, you could have easily said, take Isaac. Why does God rub it in? Take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. And So why so many words? And why the land of Moriah? Why not offer him right here? What's so special about Moriah? And offer him there as a burnt offering. We'll get to that in a minute, of course. That's the big controversy. On one of the heights I will point out to you. Anyone ever been to Israel and ask for directions? You ever been to Israel and you say, Slicha, was it derech Haifa? How do you get this the street to take me to Haifa? And the guy says, just keep going straight. And when you get someplace, ask somebody, right? Why does he mean like, go there and I'll show you where it is? Like, tell me, damn it, where I'm going. A very strange thing. But now we get to a much deeper issue. There are things the Bible tells us about characters. And there are things the Bible refuses to tell us. The Bible tells us what they do. They don't tell us what they feel. We don't know the interior life of any biblical character. And so you have to fill that in. So now look at this text. This man who has waited to the age of 100 to have his first child, and finally a miracle baby is born, and he cherishes this child because he finally has an heir, and he finally has a kid, and he finally can cherish and love this kid and know that his posterity is secure. God, the God he's been following and fighting for and representing in the world, says to him, I want his life. Kill him. What does Abraham feel? And notice that the text doesn't stop to say his, he couldn't breathe for a minute. There's nothing there. I will offer him as on one of the heights. I will point out to you, close quotation, period, close quotation. Number 3. So early the next morning. What do you mean? What's in this space right here? How did he feel? How did he feel? Well, now we got to start making up characters. We have to construct Abraham. You could say Abraham is the loyal knight of faith, in which case he said, yes, sir, I'm going to do this without a hesitation. Okay, that's possible. You could say the opposite, that a human being, a parent, a father who waits till 100, but any age, who loves his kid and is told you got to kill your kid, is going to have some anger, some disappointment, some despair, some bitterness. He's going to have some sort of a response to this. So the question is, what is Abraham feeling? Can you imagine an angry Abraham? An Abraham who said, what have I spent my whole life doing? If this is the God that I've worshiped, who would take away from me the child that he promised me. You can understand an Abraham who becomes terribly angry and bitter. My life is wasted if this is what he wants. An Abraham who is disappointed and despondent and sad. How could God want such a thing? Where is the God of life that he told me he was? Where is the God who demanded of me that I represent justice in the world? You can play that out. Okay? So hold that in. Ready? So early the next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 servants and his son Isaac. He's possibly the richest man in the world. At least the Torah tells us he's very rich. I have a hunch that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't pump his own gas. And Bill Gates doesn't change his own oil. I have a hunch that it would be far to see Sergey Brin, the guy who owns Google, sweeping his kitchen floor. I suspect he's got he's got servants right here. If he's got servants, why is he saddling the ass? Which is hard work, by the way, if you're 111 years old. Why is he doing it himself? And why early in the morning? Why early in the morning? And he split the wood. He's doing all the work himself. And he set out for the place of which God had told him. Anybody see something missing in that sentence? Anybody see someone missing in that sentence?
Where is Sarah?
Who said that? God bless you. Where is Sarah? Where's the mom? You going to take the kid? She waited. She was 90 years old and she gave birth, and you're going to, and which I don't recommend. And you're going to take him away? You're going to sneak out of the house? I gave an assignment to a class. I'm going to show you. I wrote one for you. I told my kids, I want you to write me the refrigerator note that he left for her. Dear S, love A. Now you write the rest of the note. Sneaking out early in the morning. I know why he's sneaking out in the morning. He doesn't want her to catch him. Why? Because if she saw what he was going to do,
You'd kill him.
she'd kill him. No, by the way, not a joke. Now, there are constructions of the story that say, no. Sarah knew and she supported his decision. But I have to tell you something. I've only met one person who told me that. I was teaching in a synagogue someplace. Every other time when I did this, I asked the audience, I'd like all the women in the audience to answer this question. God said to Sarah, take your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac, and take him to one of the places I'm going to show you and offer him as an offering to me. Would Sarah do it?
Hell no.
And every woman I've ever taught this, except for one, said to me, no way. Sometimes they put an adjective between no and way.
Yes. They would have God stand in the corner.
But now think about that for a minute. That's such a brilliant response. What does that tell you? Is there a difference between masculine and feminine spirituality? Is there a difference between the way fathers and mothers relate to their kids? Is there a difference between the way that we experience this, that we can somehow imagine Abraham doing this, but we can't even begin to imagine Sarah doing this? Does that tell you something about us? It's just, to me, it's an interesting observation. Just an interesting observation. So here's Abraham now, and he takes off.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
The afterwards. You ask, what is afterwards?
Yeah.
I would connect the afterwards, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Okay, good. In what way?
Well, because there God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham bargains like in a bazaar, right?
Yes.
You think, well, the same Abraham, was he trying to save the lives of the people that he doesn't know?
He doesn't know and he doesn't like, by the way.
Hmm?
Nobody likes Sodom. So
Nobody likes Sodom. There
he doesn't know them and he doesn't like them.
And he's doing his best to save them. And you think, well, it's the same Abraham. He should try to bargain with God now.
Yes.
And he doesn't. And
Why?
I think the writer is contrasting the non-bargaining here
Yes.
with the bargaining of the Sodom and Gomorrah story.
Right. And I want to know why. I want to know why he's given us these two different stories, which are so different. Where is the Abraham who stood up to God? Where is the Abraham who's the champion? He's not going to defend his own kid? I mean, come on. Very, very important observation. Thank you. Let's see what happens next. Are you ready? I know you're eager to know what happens next. On the third day. Now, so in here, here's another gap here. You see it? There's 3 days in this little gap between the period and the number 4 and in the word on. What happened during those 3 days? What happened during those 3 days? Now, I got to ask you a question. I got to ask everybody this question. You ready? Without a moment's hesitation, I want you to tell me, how old is Isaac? Go.
11.
Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum,
35.
bum, 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 bum.
36.
All right. We don't have Alex Trebek anymore. I'll have a Shalom, but we can still play the music. All right. Suppose he's a little boy, 3, 5, 7. Suppose he's 13. It's his bar mitzvah trip. Or he's 17. Suppose he's 35. He's an adult. How do those 3 days feel? Anyone ever travel with a 5-year-old? You'll want to kill him after 3 days. I guarantee it, right? Are we there yet? Can we go? I have to stop and go to the bathroom. Why can't I have a popsicle? How come you're sitting on my side of the seat? Okay. Then what's it like traveling with a 16-year-old? Anyone have that experience? So here's Isaac with his pants pulled down to his tuchas, and he's got the things in his ears. And he pulls them out and he says, are you as crazy as mom says you are? Mom says you're a lunatic. Mom says you took her all the way from her home. Are you crazy? You know, you want to kill him after 3 days too. And then maybe he's 35. You see, the difference, it's a completely different story depending on how you imagine Isaac. Now, if you really want to get complicated, let's match up each Abraham that we talked about before. A faithful Abraham, an angry, bitter Abraham, a sad, despondent Abraham with a different age kid. What would make Abraham feel even worse or even better, depending on the age of the kid? You see the variability in the story is open to us because the story leaves us these gaps so we could fill in the gaps with our imagination. All right, we got to get to the point of the story now because I know you're anxious to know what happens. On the third day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place. God didn't need to tell him. He found it himself. And Abraham said to the servants, you stay here with the boy, with the ass. The boy and I will go up and we'll worship and we'll return to you. Is he lying? We'll return to you? Is it a ruse? Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife. And this phrase in Hebrew is going to repeat twice. And the two walked off together. Ve'elchu shnechem yachdav. Together they go up the mountain. And now we have the only dialogue in the story. Isaac says to his father, and he said, yes. And he says, here are the firestone and the wood. Where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Now, if he's 5, that's an innocent little kid's question. What's going on? We've done this before. This isn't the way we do it. If he's 17, it comes with a certain amount of cynicism. New dad, are you as nuts as mom says you are? Are you going to do what mom said you're going to do? Right? And if he's 35, maybe it's a voice of reassurance. Pop, I know what we have to do, so let's go get it over with. Father, where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Is that Isaac's way of telling him, I know what's about to? Does Isaac know what's about to happen? And his answer is, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. Now, I want to tell you 2 things about that line. First of all, you see this comma right here after the word burnt offering, comma, my son? That comma is not in the Torah. That's the translator's comma. In fact, if you read the trope of this, if you're reading Torah and you learn the trope, the etnachta, the comma in the trope, comes after the word son. So the sentence in the trope reads, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son, comma, which is a whole different meaning than what we have here. And then this idea of see. There's a lot about vision in this story. You'll see that in a moment. Seeing. What do we see? And what does it mean to be seen? And once again, the two walked on together. They arrived at the place that God had told him. Abraham built an altar. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. If he's a little boy, he can overpower him. But if he's a grown man, Isaac joins him in this. And he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. And an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am, hineni, which is how the whole Abraham story starts. And he said, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. And Abraham looked up, and now he sees the ram. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it in place of his son. The Hebrew word in place, I want to come back to that one in a minute. And named the place Adonai Yireh, which means on the mount of the Lord there is vision. And now he gets a blessing. All right, now we've done the Midrash reading. We've picked up all these anomalies in the text. Now comes the huge question. What's the meaning of this text? What does this text mean? How can God ask a man to take his son? And how can God ask a man who's waited 100 years of his life to take a son? And remember, Abraham has no other heir. And God has promised him that his covenant will be passed down through his generations. So here's what happens. If Abraham kills the kid, the covenant dies. There's no one to carry it forward. But if he refuses to kill the kid, if he refuses the command, well, the covenant dies because he's no longer obedient. So this is a test you can't pass. And how could God ask him to do this? And what kind of God asks this of any parent, of any loving father, of any caring mother? What kind of God would ask this? And so this story now begins to change us and work on us. Let's begin with the most conventional interpretations, and then we're going to move to some really wild ones. Are you ready? So I gave you a whole sheet of interpretation here, because that's what we rabbis do for a living. We seek interpretations. So here you get the whole idea of surrender. This is the Abraham who is the knight of faith. So remember we asked, where's Sarah? So there's a midrash in the Tanchuma. Abraham meditated in his heart. What am I to do? Shall I tell Sarah? If I don't tell her and simply take off, when she does not see him, she'll strangle herself. So what does he do? He said to Sarah, prepare food and drink. Today we'll rejoice. And she said, why today? I love it that she speaks Yiddish, right? What's there to rejoice about? And Abraham says, old people like ourselves to whom a son is born in old age, have we not cause to rejoice? And she said, went and prepared the food. And during the meal, Abraham said, you know, when I was 3, I became aware of my maker. This lad growing up has not gone to Hebrew school yet. So there's a place far away where youngsters are taught about God. Let me take him. And this is Isaac's religious education. That was the excuse that Abraham. Now, by the way, he didn't lie exactly because but there's a bigger story now. Remember the 3 days? So the Midrash gives us what happened on those 3 days, because the Bible doesn't tell us about the 3 days. So here's what the Midrash says. As Abraham journeyed to Moriah, an old man appeared before him. It was Satan in disguise. Now, Satan is not the devil. That's not Jewish. Satan is your alter ego. It's the other side of your ego. And if Satan occurs to you as an old man and you're an old man, you're facing yourself. This is the Midrash's method for talking about a conflicted personality. Abraham is wrestling with himself. And he says, where are you going? To prayer, says Abraham. With a knife, with firestone and wood? Nobody goes to prayer like that. Well, Abraham explained, we may be delayed a day or two. We'll have to slaughter a lamb, place it on the fire to feed ourselves. It's best to be prepared. He makes excuses. He's dodging. He's rationalizing. All of us do this when conscience attacks us. And then he says, then Satan drops the masks and said, poor old man with your poor old tales. Do you think you can fool me? Don't you know I was present when the order was given? Abraham didn't reply. But Satan continued shouting, tell me, old man, have you lost your mind? Oops, I'm sorry. Have you lost your mind? Have you emptied your heart of all feeling? Will you really sacrifice your son given you at the age of 100? So this is his fatherly instinct fighting with him. So now the conflict in Abraham is between what? Between his loyalty to God and his fatherly love for his son. And what's going to win? How do you deal with that kind of a thing? Now, there's a whole lot of poetry I could have brought you, written by Israeli parents who have to bring their sons and daughters to the Gius, to the induction center when they turn 18 and join the Israeli army. And they use this image. I love my country. I love my kid. What happens when my kid demands the sacrifice of my country? If you want to read David Grossman, who's a big peacenik, he's a novelist, lost his son a couple of years ago in the army, in an army operation. And he wrestles with this. My fatherly instincts and my nationalist instincts are fighting each other. Here, Abraham is wrestling with that. Tell me, old man, will you really sacrifice your son? Yes, I shall, said Abraham. But tomorrow, old fool, tomorrow God will demand more sacrifices, more cruel yet. Will you do that too? I hope so, said Abraham. I hope to always obey him. Poor mortal. He may accuse you of murder, he who issued the order. He will condemn you for having obeyed. Will you do it nevertheless? Yes, I shall, said Abraham. I must always obey him. Now, that moment is even greater because here, what attacks him is his own conscience. You're doing something terrifying. How can you do this? You're murdering a child. How can you do this? Abraham says, God told me to do it. I'm going to do it. He becomes this very peculiar man of faith. And here's one of the questions I want to present to all of you. To what extent is obedience a Jewish value? To what extent is submission a Jewish value? Is submission to authority a value in the Jewish tradition? And how do you read this story in light of that question? Let's finish the midrash because it's going to get even more exciting now. Ready? Having failed with the son, having failed with the father, Satan tried his luck with the son. He appeared before him disguised as a boy. So again, this is now Isaac. Where are you going? To study Torah, said Isaac. Now or after your death? What a foolish question, said Isaac. Of course now. Don't you know that Torah is given to the living? Poor son of a poor woman, said Satan. For years she lived in hope and prayer to give birth to you. And now this old man, your old father, has gone mad. So the conflict in Isaac that the Midrash brings out is the conflict between his love for his mother and his love for his father. And how do you choose between the two? What an impossible choice for a loving child. Look at him. He's going to kill you, he said. Isaac didn't believe, and he looked up to his father with love. Pay no attention, son, said Abraham. His words are empty of meaning and truth. And then the Midrash ends by saying, unlike God, Satan hates to lose. Unlike God, he takes revenge. And so he goes to Sarah. And he says, where's your husband gone? To his work, she said. And where's your son Isaac? He went with his father to a place to study Torah. You poor woman, don't you know that Abraham has taken your son with him to offer him as a sacrifice to his God? And when Sarah heard this, she trembled and she died. Because the next story in the Torah is Chayei Sarah, it's the death of Sarah. And this midrash connects the two. So the question is Abraham an admirable figure for going off to do this? There were some voices in the Jewish tradition who thought so. There's some voices in the Jewish tradition who thought that this is exactly what, come down to here. This is exactly what we should be grateful for. The traditional siddur says, look down, we pray to God, look down and speedily have mercy on your people, gracious and merciful King. Remember your covenant with Abraham. Let Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Yitzchak, the binding of his only son, appear before you for Israel's sake. We do this on the high holidays as well. The question of is submission an act of merit, or is this something incredibly difficult and ugly? Incredibly difficult and ugly. Before we get to that question, I just want to show you one other sort of tradition here, right?
A comment?
Yeah, please.
You made, I think, a very profound connection to the reality of Israel today.
Yeah.
In 1982, I was in Lebanon, and my younger brother was in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
And our parents, both Holocaust survivors, did not hear from us for a week. Isn't that a similar story?
Oy. Tell me, how did it feel?
You know, I never asked them. I never dared to ask them. How does it feel?
Yeah.
To send both of your boys to war. Because there was a higher call, you know, they sent us to war for the higher call. The higher call was the safety of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's a profound question. Look, and it doesn't have to be something as radical as that. I mean, all of us have moments when we wonder whether we're doing right by our kids, we want to do everything for them, but at what point do higher values intervene? And it's a very powerful question. It's just a very, very powerful question. I don't even have an answer. You can just imagine what that did to your parents, right? It's a terrifying and difficult question. There is a tradition. I want to show you this tradition before we resolve. There is a tradition that reads the text differently. It's a tradition that says he killed Isaac. He actually killed Isaac. And then when he killed Isaac, God resurrected him. And you find this tradition in all kinds of medieval texts, particularly medieval texts that took place during the First Crusades, when there was a great amount of martyrdom, great incidents of martyrdom among Jews. This is a commentary on the Amidah. You know, there's a prayer in the Amidah, Baruch atah mechayei hametim. And so a 13th century commentary, Shibbolei Leket writes, when Abraham bound his son Isaac on the altar and slew him and burned him, the lad was reduced to ashes, and the ashes were scattered on Mount Moriah. And then the Holy One, blessed be he, brought down life-giving dew and revived him. And this isn't the only one. There's a long tradition of this in 12th, 13th, 14th century rabbinic commentaries. And what you get here is an embrace of martyrdom, an embrace of martyrdom as an ideal situation of faith. We don't think of that as a Jewish idea, but it does exist in the tradition. And where it really exists is in the Islamic tradition. And this is worth a lot more study, but this is a collection of Islamic midrash. And if you read this midrash, just read it through, they imagine Isaac as an adult. And Isaac is the one who's really calling the shots here, right? So it says, when they arrived at the mountain, Abraham said to his son, my son, I see a vision that I will sacrifice you. And Isaac says to his father, my father, do as you are commanded. If God wills it, you'll find me steadfast. And now he gives him instructions. He says, take off my shirt. I don't want my mother to see my broken body. And it's Isaac who gives all the instructions, so that you get a tradition here of martyrdom. So the two parallel traditions, which we would have a lot of trouble with, is on the one hand, a tradition which sees Abraham as a knight of faith, giving up, surrendering to God, submitting to God. And on the other, Isaac jumping forward to be a martyr. Now, one of the most profound commentaries on this story comes from a non-Jewish source. Maybe you've heard of him. There's a writer, a Danish writer of the 19th century named Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard does the following. He has a book. Kierkegaard's a very depressive guy. He lives in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and it's always raining there. And he's just a very depressive guy. So one of his books, this book is called Fear and Trembling. He has a book called Sickness Unto Death. He has a book called Dread. I mean, he's a happy guy, right? You know, a little bit of antidepressant and world literature would have been much, much more felicitous. But Kierkegaard writes the most remarkable kind of midrash on this story. And he tells the following stories. Imagine you have a good church-going fellow who goes to church on Sunday, and he falls asleep at the beginning of the service and wakes up in the middle of the sermon. And he hears the preacher talking about how what God wants you to do is take your kid to the top of the mountain and offer him there. And the guy gets it in his head that that's what God wants me to do. So he takes his kid after church, he takes his kid, and they go to the top of the hill, the tallest hill in Copenhagen, and he binds his kid on an altar, and he raises a knife over the kid. And just at that moment, the police show up, and they arrest the guy for child abuse, for attempted murder, for child endangerment. And Kierkegaard says, what's the difference? What's the difference between this lunatic on a hill in Copenhagen and Abraham? Why is Abraham so glorious to us and this guy so evil and ugly? And he says there's only one reason. And that reason is that God spoke to Abraham. And if God speaks to Abraham, Kierkegaard says, it is possible that God can command something which is thoroughly against morality, thoroughly against conscience, because the act of faith is a higher act than an act of morality. Because morality is a rule that applies to everybody, and faith is an act that's only mine. And he has a wonderful phrase for this, which I'm going to teach you now on the condition you have to make me a promise that sometime in the next week you drop this into conversation, because your friends will think you're really smart. The phrase is 3 words: the teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological means it gets me someplace. Suspension means it doesn't apply anymore, and ethical. So what he's going to say is most of us live on the aesthetic level. We pursue the things that make us happy. Many of us rise to the moral level where we pursue the things that are right and wrong. But in every generation, there's 1 or 2, just a handful, who are called on by God to perform a teleological suspension of the ethical, and they rise to the highest level, which is the level of faith. Here's Kierkegaard's words. The story of Abraham contains a teleological suspension of the ethical. As an individual, as a guy, he became higher than the universal. Universal's ethics, everybody's rule, but he's above it because God told him. This is the paradox which does not permit of mediation. It is just as inexplicable as how he got into it as how he remained in it. If such is not the position of Abraham, if that's not what's going on, then he's not even a tragic hero. See, Agamemnon, the great Greek king, had to sacrifice his daughter to keep the city from getting eaten by the sea monster. But Abraham's not doing, the sacrifice of Isaac doesn't accomplish anything. The only reason that Abraham could be admirable is if you understand that he's being called on to sacrifice not just his son, but to sacrifice his ethics, to sacrifice his morality, to sacrifice right and wrong because God told him to do it. Now, what's amazing is he gets picked up by a number of important Jewish thinkers. The most important are these 2 guys, Joseph Soloveitchik, who is the great leader of Orthodoxy in the 20th century, and Yeshaya Leibovich, who's a great leader of Israeli Judaism. And what they say is that religion demands surrender. Religion demands surrender. And if you're not willing to make that surrender, then you're never going to get that close to God. This is a certain kind of religious life. The opponent of this, of course, was Martin Buber. Martin Buber, who writes it, you can see the date, 1948. So this is right after the Shoah. And Buber goes crazy against this. And he says Kierkegaard takes for granted something that can't be taken for granted even in the world of Abraham. He doesn't take into consideration the fact that the problematics of the decision of faith is preceded by the problematics of hearing itself. Whose voice is it you hear? How do you know? It's God telling you to kill your kid. How do you know it's not Jim Jones or Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler? How do you know? How can you ever be sure? And Buber says you can't. And that's why you never accept a teleological suspension of the ethical. That's why, especially after the Shoah, ours is an age in which the suspension of the ethical fills the world in caricaturized form. All kinds of people are running around saying, I have a right to kill. I have a right to kill because I'm defending what's right. I have a right to kill. The apes of the absolute, apes means imitators, to be sure, have always in the past bustled of the earth. Ever and again, men are commanded from out of the darkness to sacrifice their Isaacs. False absolutes rule over the soul. This is one way of understanding. We have an argument here between those who would say the Akedah story is a story about the necessity of submission as the major role of faith, and those who say no. Now I want to show you the opposite tradition. Here's an opposite tradition, beginning with the Midrash and coming into modernity. And this is the answer to the gentleman's question about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I want to go back to the story for just a second. Here is the story we read. And I want to read one line with you, okay? Excuse me, one line in the Torah. You ready? So the boy is bound on the altar, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. And an angel of God said, Abraham, Abraham? And he answered, here I am. And he said, do not raise your hand against the boy. Who's talking? The angel. Or do anything to him. It's the angel. For now I know you fear God. That's the angel. Since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. Me? Somewhere in the middle of the sentence, the angel stops talking and God starts talking. That's a strange anomaly. That's a strange anomaly. So there's a midrash that picks up that anomaly and gives us back something that we were waiting for, something we all were waiting for. When God sent the angel, this is from Midrash Breshit Rabbah and Tanchuma. You find it in both places. 3rd century, 4th century. When God sent the angel to restrain Abraham, Abraham refused to heed the call. Just imagine that. God himself ordered me to sacrifice my son. It's up to him to rescind the order. Right? So the angel comes and grabs Abraham and says, don't touch the kid. And Abraham says, no, I'm going to do it. I was told to do it. I'm going to fulfill this commandment. And he's pushing the knife toward the kid. And the angel has to hook his arm around Abraham's arm and pull his arm up so the kid doesn't get hurt. Wrestling with angels is an old Jewish occupation. And there's actually a brilliant Rembrandt woodcut of this scene, in which you can see that the muscles in Abraham's arms are flexed. He's pushing down and the angel's pushing up. You ever been to Amsterdam? Anyone ever been to Amsterdam? You know where Rembrandt lived? He lived a block outside the Jewish quarter. So you can imagine, the rabbi gave a sermon, Rosh Hashanah morning. Master Rembrandt is sitting in his front yard, says to his Jewish friends, what'd the rabbi talk about? They said, he read this amazing midrash, which he found in Elie Wiesel's book, you know? And Rembrandt said, like, what did it say? And they tell him the story. Abraham refused to hear. So Rembrandt runs inside and illustrates it. Everybody in Rembrandt's pictures that's religious was Jewish, right? Because they're all people from the neighborhood. God himself ordered me to sacrifice my son. It's up to him to rescind the offer. I don't talk to underlings. I only talk to the boss. You send the boss. So God shows up. But Abraham struggles to continue. Listen here, God. You listen to me or the kid gets it. With the knife at the throat of his son, he begins to argue. This is not in the Torah. This is Midrash. And I want to show you something here because this is very important. This is the freedom of the rabbis to interpret in the way that they needed to. This is not the pshat. This is not the simple meaning of the text. This is squeezed into the line, between the lines. But they needed an Abraham because the rabbis did not appreciate, they did not want the submission of the one we saw before. They did not want martyrdom. They wanted an Abraham of conscience. So here you get this story. I swear I shall not leave the altar, Lord, before I speak my mind. Speak, says God. Didn't you promise me my descendants would be numerous as the stars in the sky? Yeah, I promised you that. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, they would be Isaac's. And didn't you promise me they would inherit the earth? Yes, I promised you that too. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, said God, they'll be Isaac's. Well then, my Lord, said Abraham in the Midrash. I could have pointed out to you before that your order contradicted your promise. Could have spoken up, but I didn't. I contained my grief and held my tongue, and in return, I want you to make me the promise that when in the future my children and children's children throughout the generations act against your law and against your will, you will also say nothing and forgive them. So be it, God agreed. Let them but retell this tale, and they will be forgiven. What a story. That's why you read the Akedah on Rosh Hashanah. Not because there's a ram in it. You read this on Rosh Hashanah because this is the story that reminds God that at the moment that it mattered, Abraham stood with his child and stood against God with his child. And all you got to do is remind God. And God will say, I will stand with you, because I want that kind of an Abraham in the world. That's what the Midrash says. I want an Abraham that protects what's right, even if he has to challenge God to do it. That's a chutzpahdik Abraham. So you get in the same story. You have in the same story. You have an endorsement of submission. That's one way to read the story. But this Midrash reads the story the exact opposite. A complete rejection of submission and the establishment of an Abraham who is able to stand in front of God and still demand justice, demand what's right. Two more just brief stories, because I know the rabbi wants to go watch the rest of the ball game, so I want to get him out of here. So I gave you two more pieces here on this page, and I'll urge you to read them. One is from my teacher, Harold Schulweis. And what Rabbi Schulweis is interested in is, why is it, whose voice does Abraham hear when the angel comes and says, do not touch the boy, do not do anything to him? Whose voice is it? And Rabbi Schulweis says, that's the voice of conscience. And the voice of conscience comes to negate the voice of religious submission. It's a lot like the Midrash, only better spelled out, right? That is, that an Abraham who would do this to his kid is a failure. But an Abraham who knew enough to stop, that's the voice of conscience that triumphs at the end of the story. That's Rabbi Schulweis's sensibility. And I wrote something that I kind of think is nice. And I took this from lots of friends of mine who wrote, so don't give me credit for it. But I want to show you back something in the story because it's important. Look at the last line of the story. Here's the last line of the story for those of you who are with me. Ready? Right? After all the blessings are done, and Abraham returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Now that's the kind of detail that you could very easily overlook, except for two things about that verse. Anybody see anything weird about that verse? First of all, where's Isaac? Twice it told us at the beginning of the story, the two of them walked up the mountain together. So how come Isaac doesn't come down the mountain?
And where's Sarah?
And where does Sarah live? Where does Abraham live? Anybody know where Abraham lives? He lives in Hebron, in Kiryat Arba. How come he's going to Beersheba? By the way, who does live in Beersheba? Hagar, the girlfriend, the au pair. None of the characters see each other alive again. In the next story, Sarah will die, and Abraham has to go bury her. Abraham then finds a wife for Isaac, but he's not there at the wedding. And Isaac will not see Abraham until Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury Abraham. And God will never again talk to Abraham. What happens at the end of this story? The family explodes. Everything dear in his life, all the bonds that gave him life explode. And suddenly he finds himself pretty terribly alone in the world. So I propose that in my reading of the story, that the voice that Abraham heard on top of the mountain, it was Sarah's voice. It was the mother's voice who said to him, what the hell are you doing? Come home. God isn't on the mountain, and God doesn't take children, and God doesn't want your loneliness. Come home. And Abraham realizes at the end, but too late, that these kinds of religious quests destroy everything that's valuable in life. That's a different way to read the story. Let's stop here, and we spent an hour. Let's get any comments, questions, counter sermons, better readings. I'd be really anxious to hear what you have.
Rabbi,
Would you like to share? Yes, please.
Leslie Weiner.
Hi.
I have to tell you, this was a fantastic study of this story. I had always come to the conclusion, I was very angry with Abraham. As Moshe said, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah, he's bargaining and bargaining. So why can't he bargain with God for his son? And then to hear these other midrashim and discussions, and I'm going to take the time to read your letter to Sarah, that, and then God doesn't talk to him again. Was God disappointed that he would follow through or might follow through? And I will read and study this portion forever in a different light and multiple lights at the same time.
Thank you. I think that's the best way to read it, and I really appreciate that. You have to understand. I think it's a one. Thank you for the kindness, but the fact that the rabbis would even ask the question in the midrash means that they weren't totally settled on this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was a little kid, they taught us, "Oh, what a wonderful man of faith is Abraham." You know, but now I'm a father, and if my kids would only get busy, I'd be a grandfather one day.
When they're ready.
I can't read it the same. I can't read this that way. It disturbs me. This story disturbs me, as does the whole notion of submission and martyrdom. Although those are big themes in Jewish tradition, but the counter theme of conscience and justice, to me, is a more inspiring theme. So I read with you. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Who else has a reading of this? Or a question, or a better sermon, yeah.
I have a question, yeah. First, Margaret, please.
Thank you. So I don't know that I have it all formulated, but it struck me at one point almost to tears. As a parent of teenagers, I'm really aware of the voices that they hear and the influences that they have, and that we struggle with as well. And so I really heard this differently than I had before, in the sense of constantly battling with them, with faith, with all of the influences that we both have, and trying to find that resolution for all of us, right? That we are concerned about sacrificing our children upon perhaps false altars, right? And so that struggle of parenthood became very real to me.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Thank you. So the sacrifice of children on false altars is a brilliant way to put it. And the other way, if we take a look at the theme that I developed here, the paradox of being a parent is I use my authority as a parent to initiate a child's independence. And it's such a terrible balance, because if I'm too heavy-handed, I will crush the kid's independence. And if I'm not protective enough, the poor kid's going to get himself hurt out there, right? So how do I give him enough freedom that he grows in, or she grows independent, but also watch out to make sure nothing happens to them? First of all, there's the pain of being a parent, right? The pain of being a parent, you know this, if your kid has their driver's license, you know, it's 11:01, where the hell are you, right? You know, and I want you to be independent. I want you to think for yourself. I want you to make good decisions. I don't want you to make dumb mistakes, because the problem is that you can make a mistake that I can't fix. You can make a mistake that I can't fix. And boy, is it scary to be the parent of an adolescent today. You know, I could go on for a while because it's one of my sermons. I'm sure the rabbi's given you the same sermon, but you know, all the dumb things we did in my generation now will get you killed, right? I mean, all of the dumb, stupid things we did now will get you killed. And that scares the hell out of us. And we want our kids to be independent. We don't want to shelter them so they don't grow up. But on the other hand, so I want you to submit, do what I tell you to do, but I want you to think for yourself. And how do you do that? How much room do we give them? Margaret, it's a brilliant, brilliant observation.
Thank you.
And the story is good. What I would suggest that you do one night, if your kids are into it, learn the story with the kids. I mean, sit down. You have all my midrashim here, and let them riff on these midrashim. Like, and ask the question, what kind of human being does this midrash shape us into? What kind of religious universe does it give us? What kind of parenting does it demand of us? It's such a wonderful question. So thank you. That was just a wonderful observation. Who else? Yes, please. Iris, is that what it says? Yeah, just unmute so we can hear you, please.
Unmute. Oh, okay. This has been wonderful, and from so many different perspectives. Aside from many other reasons that I was so bothered by Abraham's behavior, the fact that he didn't go home to Sarah, and Sarah never knew where they were, what became of Isaac, and to leave her worrying always bothered me. Maybe as a mother, maybe just, his responsibilities seemed to be confused. And I don't know what more to say, except that I just kept thinking, poor Sarah, she never really knew where they went, were they safe? All those things that you're saying at 11 o'clock at night, where are they? What's going on? Happened.
So read my letter to Sarah, which is my little midrash here. And when you're done, write one for yourself. Okay? Because I really think that you would, I think that you'll find it really, it's my attempt to try to wrestle with that question. Like, what kind of, we're partners here. I mean, he's a partner with God, but he's also a partner with her. And she's been schlepping. I mean, he schlepped her out of her home. He schlepped her across to a wasteland in Canaan. He schlepped her into Egypt, put her in a box and sold her to the Pharaoh. I mean, this is a hell of a husband, And then this is what he does to the kid she waited till she was 90 to have. My God, like, come on. Like, come on. But it's a loaded story. I got to tell you, I'll just tell you a very funny story. My first job, I was a school principal, but I taught 8th grade Bible at the Solomon Schechter School. And I used to do a thing called Bible bibliodramas. Dr. Levine was my colleague there. And I'd have the kids play out different roles in Bible stories. So it was parents' night. And I tried to demonstrate this for the parents. And I said, okay, let's pretend here. Let's pretend. I said, Mr. So-and-so, you're going to be Abraham, and Mrs. So-and-so, you're going to be Sarah. And I want you to imagine that God has just told you you're leaving home to follow God into Canaan. And let's see what you might say. And the lady starts shouting at the guy, like, damn it, you took me. And it turned out she was South African and never wanted to come to the United States. And she just took out all of her wifely rage on this man who wasn't her husband. It was just some guy, another father in the class. And I realized, it's like one of those science fiction stories where the guy finds some goo in his garage and discovers there's a nuclear bomb buried in his backyard. Like, this thing is so fraught with emotion that once you brush away the cover of it, there's such emotion here. He doesn't go home to Sarah because he knew she'd kill him. I mean, literally kill him. She doesn't go home to Sarah because she'd kill her. I mean, and we do this to each other. That's the damn thing, is how many times do we do this to each other, and we kill each other a little at a time. I mean, it's a wonderful observation. Thank you. I can go on for a while, as you can probably tell.
Let me, one more question here. What do you do what does it mean for you that we have such a variegated tradition that supports both perspectives of surrender and consciousness?
Rabbi, that's a beautiful question. That's a wonderful question. That's the glory of this tradition. It's a deep and powerful tradition. And it doesn't give you easy answers. And it demands of you a discriminating intelligence. It demands of you a discriminating intelligence to ask a question. What does my community, what does my neshama, my soul, need at this moment? Look, there are moments when we need submission. There are moments when we need people to step up. The gentleman who was speaking a moment ago about, he and his brother went off to war to defend the state of Israel and weren't thinking at that moment about what they were doing to their parents, who were both Holocaust survivors. I mean, what a powerful thing to say. It's a beautiful, there are moments when we do this, right? And there are moments when you say it's admirable and powerful and noble and virtuous, right? I remember I was in Israel. I've been going to Israel every summer for the last 20 something years. And during, one of the conflicts, one of the kids in the neighborhood got killed. It happens, it's war. And I get a call right after Shabbos from one of the guys in the minyan where I daven. He said, Eddie, could you do me a favor? Could you come over and talk to the father? The father's an American guy. He's really distraught. His 19-year-old son was just killed in Golan. And, Israeli rabbis aren't trained like you guys are. And no one really knows how to talk to him. Could you just come over? And I didn't know the man. So I went over and I spent some time with this poor guy who buried a 19-year-old son. Can you imagine? And he looked at me and he said, why? And I used this. I said, sometimes we have to give up what's most valuable for something that's even more valuable, to protect the dream. And he said, yes, that's certainly what it is, but God, does it hurt? I mean, so there are moments when that tradition is necessary. And there are moments when you want people to stand up and fight for what's right, no matter what the authority in front of them is. So the answer is, that's the beauty of a powerful tradition. It makes us into people who are ready to live in a very tough world. That's how I read it. But it demands a great discriminating intelligence as you read. I saw another hand up. I think we'll get that one and make that. David.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is far less personal. So I hate to make this the last question, but was human sacrifice a practice in
Good
the
question.
region?
Yeah, that's
and
another
so,
one of the,
can it just be an allegory to reject that?
Yeah, except for two things. Number one, if it were an allegory to reject human sacrifice, it would have said so. At the end of the story, he should have said, from now on, I don't want human sacrifice. God does that when God tells you to do something. God in the Bible is pretty direct. He doesn't want you eating shrimp. He doesn't want you working on the Shabbos, right? He wants you to fast on Yom Kippur. He wants you to put a mezuzah on the door. God is pretty direct when he wants you to do something or not do something, right? So if the point of the story was to interdict and prohibit human sacrifice, it would have said that. It doesn't say that. In fact, it's all this praise. Because you were willing to do it, you get all this bracha. And if anything, it tells you that it's something you should be wanting to do. Number two, what we know from archaeology and from anthropology is that human sacrifice was practiced in urban societies. Why in urban societies? Because you had more population. If you had more population than the walls of the city could hold in, then you had human sacrifice, right? But you didn't have human sacrifice in rural communities because one extra hand is always necessary on the farm. And specifically in nomadic societies like Abraham's, human sacrifice was never practiced. That this is not human sacrifice. That's not what this is about. What this is about is something much bigger, which is, what does God ask of us? What does it mean to be a person of faith? At what point is submission the highest value, or is conscience the highest value? Is protest the highest value? Does God allow us independence of thought, independence of morality? Those are the big questions of this story. So ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful time spending an hour in Houston with you again. I wish you very well. Take good care. Please stay safe, stay well, and let's do this again sometime with something a little happier, but let's do it again. Rabbi Teller, I turn this back over to you and to Barbara.
Rabbi, thank you so much.
So much.
We wanted Rhoda to greet us with some farewells.
Yes, Rabbi Feinstein, thank you for giving this opportunity to learn with you and to think more about what is certainly a very difficult text. And I look forward to us learning with you again. And to everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for your generosity, your commitment. I wish you a Shavua Tov, and please stay safe. And if always is my prayer, I look forward to when we can be together again in person.
And amen. Thank you so much. We can unmute and say Toda Rabbi.
Toda rabah.
Rabbi.
Toda Rabbi. Fabulous.
Toda Rabbi.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Shavua
Thank you.
tov.
Thank you all.
Shalom, shalom.
Good to see everybody. Y'all have a great day.
You too, Steve.
All right, I'm so glad we were able to bring him back. That was great.
It was.
Bye.
He's terrific.
The treat.